This is Brian, screenfiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is 2020's Castle Freak. And before I begin, I think I need to go over my feeling about reboots. I hate them. In 2012, there was a reboot of Total Recall, written by Kurt Wimmer. It wasn't a bad movie, though it changed the story a little bit, it grounded it somewhat, but it wasn't enough to make it worth making. At least I don't think it was. So, reboots on the whole bother me. Sometimes they get it right, most often than not, they don't. So, what does that have to do with Castle Freak, which is a reboot of the movie by Stuart Gordon? I'll tell you right now, Castle Freak is probably one of the best reboots ever made. I shit you not. And I don't say this because I think it's a perfect movie. It is not. I say that because it does what a good remake should always do. It takes elements that are familiar to you and changes them slightly, in a sense that it's familiar, but at the same time, what you're seeing is new and interesting and engaging. Let's not forget that. Change for change's sake is lame and pointless. This doesn't do that. It changes everything in an interesting and fascinating way. And keep in mind, this is remaking a movie directed by Stuart Gordon, which is to say, there's a high hurdle to clear. And this movie does. And in fact, I think this movie would perhaps be one of the best movies I've seen in quite a few years if there weren't for its faithfulness to the original. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a moment. If you've seen the original Castle Freak, you know pretty much what it's about. Namely, it's based upon H.P. Lovecraft's short story, The Outsider. And it is not terribly faithful to that story. That being said, it's an enjoyable, fine, a bit exploitative, deliberately so, movie. It works really well, and Stuart Gordon is a very talented director. But that being said, it's not a very good Lovecraft adaptation. What makes Castle Freak work so well is that the director, Tate Steinsick, and Kathy Charles, who wrote it, seem to be very much in sync with who Lovecraft was about as an author. Now keep in mind something. It approaches Lovecraft in a very elementary fashion. That being said, it does it accurately. And if I were to see this type of treatment in future movies as a standard, it would be refreshing and eventually get boring. It's only the fact that they seem to really know Lovecraft and appreciate his work that this works so well. In any case, the reboot works along the same lines as the original movie. It changes certain details in the sense that we don't know who the daughter's mother and father are, though we meet her. And she is blind, well, she's blinded, I should say, like the character from the original movie. And she inherits a castle, also like the character from the original movie. But that's where the changes happen, because this movie is remarkably faithful to Lovecraft's original story. In fact, I would say in the first 5 minutes of the reboot, it's more faithful to Lovecraft's The Outsider than the entire movie directed by Stuart Gordon. And again, that's not to say Stuart Gordon's movie is bad. I enjoyed it immensely, though it's not terribly faithful to Lovecraft's work. This new version is. And that's refreshing to see. And what's particularly interesting is that the creature in this movie has agency, it has purpose. In Gordon's movie, the creature didn't really have a reason to do anything. It was just kind of there and it responded to things. It had actually, I was about to say it had a purpose. And I don't think that's quite true. It didn't have a purpose. It was, at the beginning of the movie, it was imprisoned. It manages to escape. Havoc ensues. It had no real motivation for anything. While in the reboot, it definitely has reasons for what it does. It does nothing randomly. It makes sense. And this is refreshing to see. And that minor change alone changes the very character of the movie. But it gets better. because the work of Lovecraft becomes a running theme throughout the movie. There's mentions of the Necronomicon, Yog-Sluggoth. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. Yog-Sluggoth, Yug. The creatures and the mythos of H.P. Lovecraft become a theme of the entire movie. It's not at all present in the original. Here, it's made manifest and brought forward. So why things are happening are directly based upon Lovecraft. And that's so refreshing to see. A movie based upon the work of H.P. Lovecraft that actually acknowledges the world he's created. It's fascinating to see. And there's a character they call the Professor who is the font of all knowledge. Well, he's not, but he's pretty damn close to it. He's a walking exposition machine. But he's the one who knows of these connections. And it's great to see this on screen. Like I said earlier, if this becomes a common occurrence, it would become irritating. It's just the fact it's so novel to see a movie like this that I was just enraptured. It's great. And I should mention that Barbara Crampton played the wife of Jeffrey Combs' character in the original. She's a producer on this one, which is to say you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting a producer on the original movie combined with people who are new to it, bringing you something that is new, yet at the same time familiar in all the best ways. I mean, I cannot praise this movie enough. It is a great remake. Though what's kind of odd is that it has the most multicultural cast I've ever seen. And it's strange because there's no reason for it, and I applaud them for doing it, but it's just odd. And I don't know if that's sad because I haven't seen it, or sad because it's so unusual. But it was strange. Welcome, but strange. But I like the idea that you're seeing diversity on the screen that shouldn't be unusual, but for some reason is. So that was quite welcome. I mentioned earlier that one of the weaknesses of this movie is its, ironically enough, connection to the original. And when I mentioned that, I was referring to the sexuality. In the sense that the original movie was very exploitative in terms of its nudity. That's what Stuart Gordon was working with deliberately. It was by no means an accident, but a stylistic choice. Here, there's more nudity. But the thing is, most of the nudity is kind of nice. In a sense, it doesn't feel as kind of cheap and tawdry as it did in Stuart Gordon's movie. And I think this movie would have been vastly improved if they would have cut it entirely. Make this a different animal. Instead, though, it follows the blueprint laid by Stuart Gordon and his co-writer very closely. And that, in this small instance, works to the movie's disadvantage. I honestly think it would have been much better and more innovative if it would have just cut the somewhat gratuitous, though tasteful, nudity and just went with the story they have, which is so clever. As I said, it doesn't drastically change what came before, but it does change it in ways which you are not going to see coming. So good, and most importantly, I think, so faithful to the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. Another thing about this movie, it has a stinger. When the credits roll, do not leave, at least for a few minutes, because as I said, there's a stinger. And it's a clever stinger. The only problem with it is it's too obvious. If they had not unveiled this vial, I won't tell you what the vial is or from what other H.P. Lovecraft movie directed by Stuart Gordon it comes from, but if you've seen a bulk of his movies, you likely know what I'm talking about. But it's a particularly clever reveal because it lays the groundwork for more adaptations of Stuart Gordon's work, hopefully by this director, who has a real knack for Lovecraft as well as adaptation. And another thing that this movie does really well is that there's a gender switch. Oftentimes when movies do this, it tends to be kind of, dare I say, pointless, or being politically correct, whatever that means for you. Though, in this instance, it's clever and helps further the plot, and it's brilliant. I mean, I wish the original had done something of this nature, frankly. And I mentioned also how faithful this movie is to the work of H.P. Lovecraft. One thing that it does particularly well is to show events from the perspective of the creature, which is to say, sometimes you're looking at things as the creature sees them. It doesn't happen a lot, but it happens enough to establish this creature's motivations are not quite what you might think they are. And it's, for me, always interesting to have people peeking from behind paintings or that type of thing. So it works really well within that context. And another thing that I think weakens this movie slightly is that Jeffrey Combs does not make an appearance. Or Udo Kier. He didn't star in the original, but he would be perfect for this one. And there's a scene, Stinger, I mentioned earlier, which would have suited Jeffrey Combs perfectly, though he doesn't turn up. And that's a pity. But that being said, those are relatively minor complaints. And Castle Freak has to be among the best, if not the best, adaptation of the work of H.P. Lovecraft yet put on screen. So what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow. Peace.